Chapter 31. Henry Plantagenet. The Story of Thomas à Becket. King Henry was very fond of Thomas à Becket. They used to work very seriously, but when work was done they would play together like two boys. The Chancellor took care of the King's great seal, looked after the royal chapel, and had many other duties. He was a very important person, lived in splendid style, and dressed magnificently. In fact, his house and servants were richer and grander than those of the king. Many of the nobles sent their sons to serve in the Chancellor's house, and the proudest were glad to wait on him and to try to please him. Every day a great number of people dined with the Chancellor. Sometimes the king would come in from riding, in the middle of dinner, jump over the table with a merry jest, and sit down among the guests. Many stories are told of the fun the king and the Chancellor used to have together. One day, while out riding, Thomas and King Henry met an old beggar, shivering and in rags. "It would be a good action to give that poor man a coat," said the king. "It would indeed," replied the Chancellor. "Then give him yours," and the king laughingly seized the cloak which Thomas was wearing. It was a beautiful new cloak of silk and fur, and Thomas did not wish to lose it, so he held it tight, while the king tugged hard to pull it off. Neither would let go until, between struggling and laughing, they both nearly fell off their horses. The courtiers watched and laughed too, but at last the king succeeded in getting the cloak and flung it to the beggar. Thomas was not very pleased, but he had to make the best of it, and go shivering for the rest of his ride. The poor beggar went away greatly delighted with the king's joke. Once Henry sent Thomas with a message to the King of France. Thomas took so many soldiers and servants in glittering dress, so many horses and carriages with him, that the people came out of their houses to stare at him wherever he passed. "Who is it?" everyone asked. "The Chancellor of England," was the reply. "Only the Chancellor?" cried the astonished people. "What must the king be, if the Chancellor is so grand?" Henry worked hard, and with the help of his Chancellor improved many things in England. He found that the church and the clergy, like everything else, had grown very unruly and disorderly. He determined to put them in order, and Thomas à Becket, he thought, would be the best man to help him. Thomas had been brought up as a priest, and King Henry resolved to make him Archbishop of Canterbury, and head of all the clergy in England. But Thomas was gay and worldly. He loved fine clothes and rich food. "I do not want to be Archbishop of Canterbury," he said to the king. "You must be," said the king. "Then we shall quarrel," said Thomas. "Why?" said the king. "Because if you make head of the church, I shall work for the church and not for you. We shall no longer be friends but enemies," replied Thomas. But King Henry did not believe Thomas when he talked like this, and, in spite of all he could say, he made him Archbishop of Canterbury. As soon as he became Archbishop, Thomas changed his way of living. He gave up his fine house and fine clothes, and his great number of servants. He began to wear coarse, rough clothes, lived in a little narrow cell, ate very plain food, and drank only water. It is difficult to understand why he did this. Perhaps he thought that the primate of all England, as the Archbishop of Canterbury is called, ought to be a very holy man, and he knew no other way of becoming holy, for in those days if a man fasted and went barefoot and wore coarse clothing, it was thought that he must be a saint. Thomas now wrote to the king and told him that he must find another chancellor, as he could not be Archbishop and Chancellor too. This was a great surprise and grief to the king. In those days it was nothing unusual for one man to be Archbishop as well as Chancellor. Henry had expected Thomas still to be Chancellor and still to help him. He had merely made him primate so that he should help him more. But that was only the beginning of the troubles. The Bishop of Rome, whom we call the Pope, said that he was the head of the whole Christian Church, and that no one could be made a bishop in England without his consent. Henry said that he, the king, was the head of the English Church, and he would make what bishops he chose. Thomas, instead of siding with the king, sided with the Pope, so they quarrelled, as Thomas had warned Henry that they would. In those days some of the clergy had grown very wicked. Instead of leading good lives and being an example to others, they led bad lives. Priests and clergy who did wicked things were not judged by the same courts as other people. They were judged by a bishop's court. Now a bishop's court had no power to order any very severe punishment. If a priest killed a man, the worst that could happen to him would be that he would be beaten, not very hard, and have only bread and water to live on for a few days. Many wicked people became priests simply that they might be able to do as much wrong as they liked, without being punished for it. Henry wished to put an end to this, so he said that all people who did wrong must be tried by the same judges, whether they were priests or not. But Thomas à Becket would not agree. Clergymen had always been judged by a bishop's court, he said, and by a bishop's court they should continue to be judged. So the king and the primate quarrelled worse than ever, till the quarrel grew so fierce, and the king so angry, that Thomas fled over the sea to escape from him. After a time Henry forgave Thomas, and he came back to England, but almost at once he again began to quarrel with the king. This time Henry lost all patience, and in a burst of anger he exclaimed, "Are there none of the idle people who eat my bread that will free me from this quarrelsome priest?" Henry was angry, and did not really mean what he said, but 4 knights heard, and, thinking to please their king, they took ship, for Henry was in Normandy at this time, crossed the sea to England, and rode to Canterbury. Arrived there, they went to the archbishop's house. They found him almost alone. With angry words they told him that he must either promise not to quarrel with Henry, or he must leave England. "I shall do what I think is right," replied Thomas. "If the king tells me to do things which I think are wrong, I will not obey him. I am the servant of God. God is higher than the king. I shall obey him." This answer enraged the knights, and more angry words were spoken. Then they went away, telling Thomas to beware, for they would come again. "You will find me here," replied Thomas proudly. "Never again will I forsake my people." All the archbishop's friends, and the monks and priests who lived with him, were very much afraid. They felt sure that these angry knights meant to do something dreadful. They begged Thomas to leave his house and take refuge in the cathedral, but he would not. "I said they would find me here," he replied to all entreaties. The day passed. The time for evening service came. Then only did Thomas consent to leave his house and go into the cathedral, for, he said, "It is my duty to lead the service." The priests tried to hurry him, they tried to drag him along quickly, but Thomas would not hasten. He walked slowly and solemnly, having the great cross carried before him as usual. He feared no man. When at last he was safe within the cathedral, the priests wished to lock and bar the doors, but Thomas forbade them. "This is not a fortress, but the house of God, into which everyone is free to enter. I forbid you to bar the doors," he said. The priests were in despair. They loved their archbishop, they knew that he was in danger, but he would not try to save himself. Even as he spoke, there was a great noise without. The door burst open, and the 4 knights, dressed in complete armor and carrying drawn swords in their hands, rushed into the cathedral. The frightened people fled in all directions. The archbishop was left almost alone. Only 3 remained with him, his cross-bearer, and 2 other faithful friends. In the dim twilight which filled the cathedral, it would have been easy for Thomas to escape, but he would not go. "I told them that they should find me here," he said again to the monks who tried to drag him away. Even as it was, the knights could not find him. In the gathering darkness they clanked and clanged through the great church, seeking him. "Where is the traitor?" called one of them. No one answered. Only the word traitor echoed again through the silence. "Where's the Archbishop?" he called again. "I am here," answered the voice of Thomas à Becket out of the darkness. "I am here, no traitor, but a servant of God. What do you want?" They stood before him, 4 armed knights against 1 unarmed priest. Yet he was not afraid. "Will you be at peace with the king?" asked the knights. "What I have done I shall continue to do," replied Thomas. "Then die." The knights seized him and tried to drag him out of the cathedral, for they feared to kill him in a holy place. But Thomas would not go. He held tightly to a pillar. His cross-bearer, still holding the cross, threw one arm round the archbishop, trying to protect him. The knight who had first spoken struck at Thomas. The cross-bearer received the blow upon his arm, which dropped to his side, broken. The next stroke fell on Thomas à Becket's defenseless head. In a few minutes all was over. "In the name of Christ and for the defense of the Church, I die willingly," said Thomas, and spoke no more. Then the knights, fearful of what they had done, fled, leaving the dead archbishop alone in the dark, silent cathedral. End of chapter 31. Read by Kara Schallenberg. www.kray.org. On June 19th, 2006, in Oceanside, California. Chapter 32. Henry Plantagenet, the story of the conquest of Ireland. When Henry heard of what had happened to Thomas à Becket, he was very sorry, but strangely enough he had no power to punish the 4 knights. Their sin was a sin against the Church, and they could only be tried by a bishop's court. The bishop's court punished them by sending them on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. So Thomas à Becket, in quarrelling with the king, had protected his own murderers. But perhaps their punishment was very real, for they were forsaken and shunned by all their friends. No one would speak to them, nor eat with them, and at last they died in misery and loneliness. All England was filled with horror at the dreadful deed. The people had loved Thomas when he was alive. Now that he was dead, they called him a saint. From far and near they came as pilgrims to his grave, over which a splendid shrine, glittering with gold and gems, was placed. Nearly 4 years later, the king himself came as a pilgrim to show his sorrow and repentance. He rode on horseback to Canterbury, but, as soon as he came within sight of the cathedral, he got off his horse and walked barefoot, wearing only a shirt, and carrying a lighted candle in his hand, until he reached the shrine. For a whole day and night, having nothing to eat or drink, he knelt in prayer before the grave. For a still greater punishment, he made the monks beat his bare back with knotted cords. All this show of sorrow could not bring back the great archbishop, who had been murdered in consequence of a few words spoken in anger. But it pleased the Pope, who was very angry because Thomas à Becket had been killed. He blamed Henry, and would scarcely believe that he had not told the 4 knights to do the wicked deed. In those days the Pope was very powerful indeed. Even kings stood in awe of him, and Henry was glad to make peace with him by any means in his power. Until now in this book we have spoken only of England, although England is but one of the countries which form the United Kingdom. Each of these countries has a history of its own, but it would be too difficult to tell all the stories in one book, so I shall tell only the story of each country after it has been joined to England. There are 4 countries in the United Kingdom: England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. Of these, England and Ireland were the first to be joined together. This happened in the reign of Henry II, in 1172 A.D. England, you remember, had at one time been divided into 7 kingdoms, and in the same way Ireland was still divided into 4, and the kings of these 4 divisions were always fighting with each other. Now one of these kings, who was called Dermot, came to Henry and asked for help against another of the Irish kings. Henry promised help if King Dermot would acknowledge him as overlord. This King Dermot said he would do. Henry was very glad to fight with the Irish because he knew it would please the Pope, and perhaps make him forget about the death of Thomas à Becket. The Pope was angry with the Irish because they would not pay him some money to which he thought he had a right. Henry first sent some Norman knights over to Ireland, and then went himself. There was a good deal of fighting, but in the end Ireland was added to England, and ever since the kings of England have been lords of Ireland too, although many years passed before they could be said really to rule there. Henry's great reign closed in sorrow. His sons did not love him, and they rebelled and fought against him. They were encouraged in this by their mother, who was not a good woman. 2 of Henry's sons died before him, both of them while fighting with their father. 2 others, called Richard and John, were kings of England after him. John was Henry's favorite son. He was the only one who had not rebelled against him. But when the king lay very ill, the nobles came to tell him that John, too, had rebelled. This last sorrow broke Henry's heart. Crying out, "Ah, John, John, now I care no more for myself nor for the world," he turned his face to the wall and died. Henry was a very rich king, for, besides being King of England and Lord of Ireland, he was ruler over more than half of France. Later you will hear how one of his sons lost all these French possessions. End of chapter 32. Read by Kara Schallenberg. www.kray.org on June 19, 2006, in Oceanside, California. Chapter 33. The Story of Richard Coeur de Lion. This King Richard, I understand, ere he went out of England, let make an axe for the nonce, therewith to cleave the Saracen's bones. The head, in sooth, was wrought full weal, thereon was 20 pounds of steel. The country where Christ was born, lived, and died is called Palestine. The capital of that country is Jerusalem. From that far-off country the story of Christ was carried all over the world. Many listened to the story and were glad, but the country where he lived fell into the hands of the Saracens and Turks, who neither believed in nor loved Christ. When people for the love of Christ went the long, long journey to Palestine, in order to see for themselves the Holy Sepulchre, these Saracens and Turks ill-treated them and insulted their religion. At last a monk called Peter the Hermit went through Europe, preaching and calling upon all Christians to fight for the city of their Lord. If they truly loved Christ, he said, they would deliver his grave from the hands of the Saracens. At his call Christian people rose, eager to show their love, and journeyed to Palestine, but the way was long and difficult, and few reached the capital. The people, however, were not disheartened, and the following year a great army set out, which did reach Jerusalem, and after much fighting the Holy Sepulchre was taken from the Turks. Later on the Turks took it back again, and so, for nearly 200 years, with times of peace between, Christians and Turks were at war. These wars were called Crusades, which means Wars of the Cross. The word comes from the Latin word crux. They were called Crusades because the people who fought in them were fighting for the place where Christ died upon the cross. As a badge or sign, they wore a cross upon their armor or clothes. Many kings and princes joined these wars. Henry II had been making ready to go to Palestine when he died. His son Richard I, who was king after him, made up his mind to go as soon as he was crowned. Richard had not been a good son. He had helped to make his father's last days unhappy, but when his father was dead he was sorry for what he had done, and he punished the people who had helped him to rebel, instead of rewarding them as they had expected. Richard was very brave, as his name, Coeur de Lion, which means lion-hearted, shows. He was a great soldier. He loved to fight. He loved to have adventures. So instead of staying at home and looking after his kingdom as he ought to have done, he went far away to Palestine to fight. And his people were proud of their king and glad to have him go, for they knew that he would make the name of England famous wherever he went, although Richard himself was really hardly English. He had indeed been born in England, but he had lived nearly all his life in France, and he did not know nor care much about the English people. Richard Coeur de Lion came to England to be crowned. He sold everything he could in order to get money for the crusade, for wars always cost a great deal of money, and then he sailed away. But first he chose 2 bishops to rule the country while he was gone. One was a very old man, and the other, William Longchamps, was Norman. He could hardly speak a word of English, and he treated the people so badly that they hated him, and soon rebelled. Now Richard's younger brother John wanted to be king of England, so he encouraged the people to rebel. Then he began to rule, but the unhappy people soon found that John was no kinder than William Longchamps. Indeed, he was rather worse, for John wanted the kingdom for himself, and Longchamps, although proud and haughty and cruel to the people, was at least true to his king. John and his Norman friends oppressed the people, and the hatred between English and Norman, to which Henry II had done so much to put an end, flamed up again. Many of the English left their homes, or were driven from them, and the land became full of robbers and outlaws. One of the most famous of these outlaws was Robin Hood. He lived in Sherwood, a forest which at that time covered a great part of the centre of England. He was the head of a large band, and so powerful was he that he was called the King of Sherwood. And indeed his followers loved and obeyed him, as they would have done a king. Robbers, as a rule, are not men to be admired, but these were wild times, very different from ours, and Robin had been forced to become a robber through the wickedness of the rulers of the land. Among his own band he kept such good order that in Sherwood women and children could wander safely, where it was dangerous for haughty knights and wicked priests to go. Robin's rules were strict, and those who would not obey them were driven out of the band of merry men, as his followers were called. But look ye, do no husbandman harm, that tilleth with his plough. No more ye shall the good yeoman, that walketh by greenwood shaw. Nor no knight, nor no squire, that will be good fellow. These bishops and archbishops, ye shall them beat and bind. The high sheriff of Nottingham, hold him in your mind. The sheriff of Nottingham was Robin's greatest enemy. Many times he tried to catch Robin, but he never succeeded. In those days bows and arrows were used in battle instead of guns, as gunpowder had not been invented. Bows and arrows were also used for hunting wild animals. The English archers were the most famous in the world, and Robin Hood was the most famous archer in England. He could split a willow wand, and hit a mark which another man could hardly see. Robin and his men lived in caves in the forest, shooting the king's deer for food and getting money by robbing the rich knights and priests who travelled through the green wood. But they never hurt or robbed the poor people. Indeed, Robin used to help many of them. The common people loved him, although the rich and great barons and nobles hated him. Far away in Palestine, news of the wicked things which John was doing reached Richard, and he felt that it was time that he should go home again. He had not succeeded in what he had set out to do. He had not won Jerusalem from the Turks, but he made a truce with their great leader, Saladin. A truce means that the people who have been fighting do not make peace for good and all, but that they promise not to fight against each other for some arranged time. Saladin and Richard made a truce for 3 years, during which time Saladin promised that no harm should be done to the pilgrims who came to the Holy Sepulchre. Richard set sail for home, but his heart was in the Holy Land. Tears filled his eyes as its shores grew dim in the distance. Stretching out his hand as if in prayer, "Blessed land," he cried, "farewell. To God's keeping I commend thee. May he give me life that I may return to deliver thee from the hand of the unbeliever." As Richard sailed homeward, storms arose, and his ship was wrecked upon the shore of Austria. Nearly everyone was drowned, but the king and a few of his knights escaped. While in Palestine, Richard had quarrelled with the Duke of Austria, and he knew that it would not be safe to travel openly in this land. So the king and his knights disguised themselves as merchants, hoping in that way to pass safely on their journey. But they had many adventures, and more than once were nearly discovered. At last Richard was left with only one knight and one little page. When they arrived at the large town near which the Duke of Austria lived, Richard and the knight lay hidden, while the page went into the town to buy food. They had been traveling for several days without daring to enter a house, and all the food they had was finished, and they were both weary and hungry. Richard, like many brave and reckless people, was neither thoughtful nor careful. He gave the page a large sum of money, and allowed him to go into the town carrying the king's gloves in his belt. In those days only very rich people wore gloves, and Richard's were beautifully embroidered with silk and gold, such as only kings and princes wore. The page had often before bought food for his master, and he went fearlessly into the marketplace to get what was needed. But when he handed the merchant a large piece of gold in payment, the man looked sharply at him. "Who is your master?" he asked. "My master is a rich merchant called Hugh," replied the boy. "He is returning from a pilgrimage to the Holy Land." "Merchant indeed," said another man. "Look at his gloves." A third plucked them from his belt. "Merchant indeed," he too cried. "These are king's gloves. Who is your master, boy?" "I have told you," replied the page steadily. "He is a merchant called Hugh." But the townspeople would not believe that. They beat and tortured the poor lad. Still he would not tell. They dragged him before the duke with whom Richard had quarrelled in Palestine. He was more strong and cruel than the others, and at last forced the page to confess that his master was Richard Coeur de Lion, the King of England. Then Leopold, Duke of Austria, was very glad. He hated Richard with a great hatred. He sent soldiers to the king's hiding-place, seized him, and put him in prison. Duke Leopold kept Richard prisoner for some time, and then he sold him to the Emperor of Germany for a large sum of money. The Emperor of Germany also hated Richard, so he, in his turn, put him into prison. Then the Emperor wrote to the King of France, telling him that the King of England was safely imprisoned in one of his strong castles. And King Philip of France was glad, for he too hated Richard, and had been helping Prince John stir up the English people to rebellion. When Prince John heard about it, he was glad too. So a great many people rejoiced that Richard Coeur de Lion was in prison. End of chapter 33. Read by Kara Schallenberg. www.kray.org. On June 19th, 2006, in Oceanside, California. Chapter 34. Richard Coeur de Lion, the story of how Blondel found the king. Richard Coeur de Lion, who loved to be free, who loved to fight and ride and hunt, to do great deeds of strength and daring, hated to be shut up in a dark and narrow prison. Yet he did not despair. He loved, too, to laugh and sing, and he made friends with his jailers, wrestling and fighting with them, and astonishing them by his great strength. And when he was weary of that, he would sing to them, or write poetry. but sometimes he was sad. Although nearly all the poetry which Richard wrote has been lost, one mournful little song which he made in prison is still left. It was written in French, for Richard, you remember, was almost French, and could speak very little English. Here it is, in English words. No captive ever sings so sweet a strain as he who weareth not the prisoner's chain. Yet song may glad his days of weariness. Friends fail me not, but shame for them I fear, if I for lack of gold this vile duress sustain another year. Well know my knights and servants every one, English, Poitevin, Norman, or Gascon, that to no comrade would I help refuse, but I would spend my wealth till he were free. And this I say, yet them I not accuse, for my captivity. True, it is said, and I have learned it sore, dead folk no lovers have, nor captives more. But if to save their wealth here I do lie, disgrace and scorn shall unto them be still. And if I suffer, more they suffer will, though I be left to die. Prince John felt that nothing now stood between him and the throne of England. He told the people that the king was dead, and would never come back again. He seized the royal castles and what gold and jewels he could find belonging to the king in England. But the English would neither believe nor follow John. Meanwhile, Blondel, a minstrel or singer who loved King Richard, took his harp, and wandering from castle to castle, sought his master all through Germany. For the emperor kept secret where he had imprisoned Richard. Wherever Blondel heard of some unknown prisoner, there he stopped and sang a song which Richard and he had made and sung together. Again and again Blondel sang this song, but no answering voice ever came from any of the grim castle walls. At last one evening, weary and almost hopeless, he began to sing beneath the walls of a castle called Trifels. O Richard, O my king, thou art by all forgot. Through the wide world I sadly sing, lamenting thy drear lot. Alone I pass through many lands, alone I sigh to break thy bands. O Richard, O my king, thou art by all forgot. Through the wide world I sadly sing, lamenting thy dread lot. Blondel's voice was sad and broken, his heart was heavy, and he could scarcely sing for tears. But hardly had he finished the first verse when, from a window high above him, another voice took up the tune and sang. The minstrel's song is love alone, fidelity and constancy, though recompense be none. The voice rang out clear and full and strong. Blondel knew and loved it. It was the voice of Richard Coeur de Lion. Blondel leaned his head back against the rough stone of the castle wall and wept for joy. He had found his king. Back to England the minstrel went with his great news, and when the English people heard it they were glad. But the emperor would not set Richard free until the people paid a large sum of money called a ransom. The land had already been made very poor through the wars and robberies of John, but the English people wanted their king so much that they denied themselves almost everything in order to raise enough money. When they had gathered the money, they sent it to the emperor, and Richard was at last set free. As soon as he was out of prison, Richard hurried to England. He must have been glad to see the white cliffs of his own land again. He had been away 4 years, and 14 months of that time he had been shut up in a dark and lonely prison. The people were so glad to see their king again that, poor though they were, they had such grand decorations and rejoicings that a German knight who came home with Richard was quite astonished. "Had my lord the emperor known," said he, "how rich a country England still was, he would have demanded yet more money." Richard set himself at once to bring order into the kingdom. Most of the people were on the side of the king, and Prince John soon submitted to him. Their mother, Queen Eleanor, begged Richard to forgive his brother. "I forgive him," said Richard, "and I hope I shall as easily forget the wrong he has done me as I know he will forget my pardon." He knew that John was not really sorry, and would rebel again as soon as he had a chance. Richard remained in England only a few months, and then he went to France. There he spent the rest of his life, chiefly fighting with the king of that country. But Richard left a good and wise man to rule in England, and the people were happier, although they had to pay heavy taxes in order to help Richard in his French wars. This was very unfair, as these wars did England no good. But as long as the kings of England had possessions in France, the English had to pay for French wars. So it was a good thing for England when at last all the French possessions were lost. Richard was killed in France in 1199 A.D., while besieging a castle called Chaluz. He was riding round the walls with one of his captains, looking for the best place of attack, when a young archer put an arrow to his bow, and saying, "Now, God speed my arrow," let it fly. The arrow hit Richard in the shoulder. The wound was not a bad one, but doctors in those days were not very clever, and the doctor who drew out the arrowhead did it so badly that the wound was made much worse. In a day or two it became so bad that Richard felt he was going to die, but he swore that he would first take the castle and kill the archer who had caused his death. The castle was taken, and Richard in his terrible wrath hanged all the soldiers except the archer. He was kept for some more dreadful death. Richard was lying in great agony when the young archer was brought before him. "Villain," said the king, looking fiercely at him, "what have I done to you that you should kill me?" The young man drew himself up, and looking proudly at the king, and not in the least afraid of his angry frown, replied, "With your own hand you killed my father and my 2 brothers. Kill me, torture me if you will. I am glad to die, having rid the world of one who has wrought so much ill in it." Then there was silence between these 2 proud, brave men, as they looked each other in the eyes, the one a poor soldier, the other a dying king. But Richard, although fierce and hasty, was generous, and above all things he loved courage. "Boy," he said, "I forgive you." Then, turning to his captains, "Loose his chains," he added, "let him go free, and give him 100 shillings to boot." So Richard Coeur de Lion died. He was so brave that all Europe rang with his fame. The Saracens stood in such awe of him that when little children were naughty, their mothers would say to them, "Be good now, or Richard of England will come to you." And the children would be good at once for fear of him. "Thinkest thou that Richard of England is in that bush?" a rider would say to his horse if it were startled. So great was the terror of his name. Richard was a good knight and a brave soldier, but he was not a good king. He reigned for 10 years, yet only 6 months of that time did he spend in England. No doubt he thought it was a great and good thing to fight for Jerusalem, but how much better it would have been if he had tried to rule his own land peacefully and bring happiness to his people. End of chapter 34. Read by Kara Schallenberg. www.kray.org. On June 23rd, 2006, in Oceanside, California. Chapter 35. John Lackland. The story of Prince Arthur. When Richard Coeur de Lion died, his brother John, who had plotted and rebelled against him when he was alive, became king. He was called by the French John sans terre, which means without land, and John Lackland by the English. He was so called because when his father Henry II died, John had no kingdom left to him, as his brothers had. John was the youngest and the worst of all Henry's sons, and he was not the heir to the throne of England. The real heir was Prince Arthur of Brittany, the son of John's elder brother Geoffrey. And now the French king Philip, who had fought against Richard and helped John, suddenly turned round, and began to fight against John, because he would not let Arthur be king. John was wicked and wily, and he easily got Arthur into his power and shut him up in prison. But John was not content with that. He greatly feared that the English people might want to have Arthur as their king, and he resolved to make that impossible. Prince Arthur was placed in the charge of a man called Hubert, and wicked King John ordered this man to put out Arthur's eyes. Hubert actually said he would do this cruel deed. One morning he brought 2 men into Arthur's room, ready to put out his pretty blue eyes with their dreadful hot irons. Arthur was a gentle, loving boy, and he was fond of his stern jailer, and Hubert, in his own rough way, was fond of the little prince. Now he felt sad and sick at heart at the thought of what he had to do. "Are you ill?" said Arthur. "You look so pale. I wish you were a little ill so that I could nurse you and show you how much I love you," he added. When Arthur spoke to him so kindly, the tears came into Hubert's eyes, but he brushed them away and determined to do what the king had commanded. "I am not ill, but your uncle has commanded me to put out your eyes," he said roughly. "To put out my eyes? Oh, you will not do it, Hubert." "I must." "Oh, Hubert, Hubert, how can you?" said Arthur, putting his arms round Hubert's neck. "When your head ached only a little, I sat up all night with you. Now you want to put out my eyes, these eyes that never did nor never shall so much as frown upon you." "I have sworn to do it," said Hubert sadly. "Oh, but you will not do it, you will not. You will not, Hubert." And so Arthur begged and prayed till Hubert could resist no longer, and he sent the wicked men with their dreadful red-hot irons away. But Hubert was afraid that King John would be angry because his orders had not been obeyed, so he told him the cruel deed had been done, and that Prince Arthur had died of grief and pain. Then wicked King John was glad, but the people both in France and England were very sad when they heard this news. Everyone mourned for the young prince. All through the land bells were tolled, as if for a funeral. There was so much anger against John, and so much sorrow for the prince, that at last Hubert told the people that what he had said was not true, and that Arthur was still alive. Then everyone was glad. Even King John was glad at first, because many of his nobles had told him plainly that he would find no knight to follow him to battle, nor to guard his castles at home, if he had really killed his little nephew. But King John's heart was black and wicked, and he could not rest while he knew that Prince Arthur lived. So one dark night he came to the castle in which his nephew was kept prisoner. After that night no one ever saw Prince Arthur again. Next morning, when the sun shone in at the narrow window where he used to sit, it shone into an empty room. For Arthur's poor little body was lying at the bottom of the Seine, with a great wound in his heart made by his wicked uncle's cruel, sharp knife. End of chapter 35. Read by Kara Schallenberg. www.kray.org. On June 23rd, 2006, in Oceanside, California. Chapter 36. John Lackland. The Story of the Great Charter. The French barons soon grew weary of John and his misrule, and they all leagued against him. They fought and conquered him, and he had to fly from Normandy, which, with all his other French possessions, were lost to him forever. But although he was no longer Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, Lord of Touraine and Maine, John was still King of England, and to England he returned, to rob and oppress the people. The wise man called Hubert Walter, who had ruled England during the last years of Richard Coeur de Lion, now died. He had been Archbishop of Canterbury, and John was very glad when he died, as he was one of the few men who kept him from doing just as he liked. John chose a friend of his own as the next archbishop, but the monks of Canterbury chose someone else. Both these men went to the Pope to ask him which of them ought to be the archbishop. Henry II, you remember, had quarrelled with Thomas à Becket over this very point, because, he said, he had the right to choose the English bishops, and the Pope had nothing to do with it. The Pope said that neither of these men should be archbishop, and he chose another man altogether, called Stephen Langton. Stephen Langton was a very good man. In fact, no better archbishop could have been chosen. But John was furiously angry when he heard that his friend was not to be allowed to be archbishop, and he banished Stephen Langton from the country. Then the Pope was very angry with John, and told him that, if he did not allow Stephen to come back at once, he would lay England under an interdict. Interdict comes from a Latin word which means to forbid. The Pope meant that he would forbid any religious service of any kind to be held in England. John did not care. He meant to have his own way. So did the Pope. John would not give in, and the churches were closed. No bells were rung, no services were held. People could not be married, little babies could not be christened, dead people could not be buried. Cobwebs and dust filled the churches. Weeds choked the graveyards. It was a sad and gloomy land. Still, John did not care. Then the Pope excommunicated him. Excommunicate is another Latin word, and means that John was put out of union or companionship, not only with the Church, but with every human being. The Pope told the people that John was no longer king, and that they need not now obey him. They were forbidden to eat or drink with him or to serve him. Whatever he did was wrong. In fact, he had lost all rights as a man and as a Christian. He might be looked upon as a wild animal. Anyone who chose might kill him. Still John did not care. He laughed at the Pope. Then the Pope told the King of France that he would be doing a good and Christian act if he conquered John and took possession of England. The French king was only too pleased to have a good excuse for invading England, and he began at once to prepare to fight. Then suddenly John grew frightened and gave way. He had found out that not only the Pope and the French were against him, but the Scotch, the Irish, the Welsh, and even the English were all ready to fight. He was alone in the world, hated and despised by all. So powerful was the Pope in those days. From being insolent and scornful, John now became meanly humble, and did a shameful thing. The Pope sent a messenger to England, and John, kneeling before this messenger, took the crown from his head and gave it to him. The Pope's messenger kept the crown for 5 days, and then he gave it back to John. But he did not give it to him as the free King of England. He gave it to him, telling him that henceforth he could wear it only as the servant of the Pope, and that he must promise always to do as the Pope commanded. The English people felt sad and ashamed that their king should be under the Pope like this, but John did not care, for the Pope was now his friend. And John knew that the Pope could be as powerful a friend as he had been an enemy. One good thing at least followed. The interdict was taken from the land. Once more church bells rang, hymns were sung, and the silent gloom passed away. Another good man who had helped to protect the people from John now died. When John heard of it, he was very glad. "At last I am really King of England," he cried, for he thought that there was no one else in all the land to hinder him from being as bad and cruel as he wished. But he was mistaken. Stephen Langton, the man whom the Pope had made Archbishop of Canterbury, turned out to be the people of England's best friend. You remember that King Henry I had granted a charter of liberties to the people. That charter had been broken, set aside, and forgotten. Stephen Langton and the barons now drew up another charter, which they determined to make John grant to them. This charter was much the same as that of Henry, only it gave still greater liberty to the people. It is called the Magna Carta, or the Great Charter. Magna means great. The charter is very long, and some of it you would find difficult to understand, but I will tell you a few of the things in it, for the Magna Carta is the foundation of all our laws and liberty. No free man, it says, or merchant or peasant, shall be punished a great deal for a very little fault. However bad they may have been, we will not take their tools or other things by which they earn their living away from them. No free man shall be seized or put in prison, or have his goods and lands taken from him, or be outlawed or exiled, or in any way brought to ruin, unless he has been properly judged and condemned by the law of the land. To no man will we sell, or deny, or delay right or justice. These things seem to us now quite natural and right, so you can imagine what evil times these were, when the king was unwilling to grant such liberty to his people. But King John was very unwilling to grant it. When he first read this charter, he was furiously angry. "Why do they not ask for my kingdom at once?" he cried. "I will never grant anything that will make me a slave of the people." But the church and the barons and the people were all against John. Agree he must. Yet he kept delaying, from Christmas till Easter, from Easter till midsummer. Friend after friend deserted him, till at last he found that the whole country had risen against him like one huge army, and he had only 7 knights left who were still true to him. The angry barons would no longer be put off. They forced the king to meet them at a little place on the Thames called Runnymede. The barons and their army camped on one side of the river, the king and his friends on the other. On a little island between they met and talked, and there, on the 15th of June, 1215 A.D., the Great Charter was sealed with the king's great seal. The king was sullen and angry. At the last he would have refused to set his hand to the seal, but Stephen Langdon stood beside him, and the stern barons around. Then he found that he had to bend his will to that of the people. John not only sealed the charter, but he agreed that 24 barons should be appointed to see that he kept the promises which it contained. He agreed only because he was compelled, because the barons stood there in bright armor with sharp swords and fierce looks, because he knew he had no friend to stand by him and help him to resist. When the meeting was over and John went back to his palace, his anger was terrible. He threw himself on the floor, foaming with passion. "They have given me 24 overlords," he screamed. "I am no king with 24 overlords." He cursed the barons and the people with terrible curses. He tore and bit the rushes with which the floor was covered. He gnashed his teeth, growling and snarling like a wild animal mad with rage. Yet this charter, against which John fought so fiercely, was nothing new. The laws and promises it contained were the laws and promises of Edward the Confessor, of Alfred the Great. But they were also the laws and promises which the foreign kings of England had broken and trampled on ever since William the Conqueror had won the Battle of Hastings. Many copies of the Great Charter were made, and these copies were sent to cathedrals and other safe places to be taken care of. This was done so that the people throughout all the land should know of their liberties, and if one copy were lost or destroyed, there should still be others. It is nearly 700 years since the Magna Carta was sealed, yet one copy still remains. It is yellow and stained, but we treasure it greatly for the memory of what it was and is to us. It is kept safely in London, in the British Museum. Some day you will go there and look at it. John sealed the Magna Carta because he had no choice, but he never meant to keep the promises it contained. And he did not keep them. He sent to France for soldiers, and when they came he made war on his own people. He asked his friend the Pope for help, and the Pope helped him, by excommunicating all the barons, by laying London under interdict, and by telling him that he need not keep his promises. But the people of England said that this was a matter with which the Pope had nothing to do, and so they paid no attention to him. The church bells rang, there was preaching, praying, and singing in the churches, and people were married and buried and christened as usual. The Pope was very angry, but he could do nothing. Then, as John still went on his wicked way, the people sent to France and asked Louis, the son of the King of France, to come to fight against John, promising to help him and to make him King of England. Louis came, but there was little need for him to fight, as very shortly John died. While crossing the Wash to meet Louis, he, his army, and all his treasure were overtaken by the tide. John himself was nearly drowned, and his crown, his jewels, and the baggage of the army were lost. A few days later John died. Some say that he died of anger and grief, others that he was poisoned, others that his death was caused by eating a great many raw peaches, and by drinking a quantity of new cider too greedily. No king of England has ever been so bad as John. He was a bad son, a bad brother, a bad king, and a bad man. Yet out of his wicked reign great good came to the English nation. The loss of Normandy, which was caused by John's cruelty, proved to be a blessing to England. Norman lords no longer came to England expecting to fill the best places in the land. French was spoken less and less, until only a few French words remained, which we still use, and which now form part of the English language. The hatred between Norman and English died out, because the differences disappeared, and the Norman barons became English barons. In the reign of Stephen, the barons, you remember, were fierce and wicked, and oppressed the people in terrible ways. In the reign of John, the barons had become the champions of the people, and took up arms for them against a wicked king. When the barons forced John to grant the Magna Carta, they fought, not for themselves, as barons and Normans, but for the whole English people. For the first time since the Conquest, the people of England acted as one people. The Normans had disappeared. England was England again. She had conquered the conqueror. This England never did, nor never shall, lie at the proud foot of a conqueror, if England to itself do rest but true. End of chapter 36. Read by Kara Schallenberg on June 23, 2006, in Oceanside, California. Chapter 37. Henry of Winchester, the story of Hubert de Burgh. When King John died, the anger of the barons died too, and, although he was only 9 years old, they chose his son Henry to be their king. "His father was wicked," said the barons, "but the prince has done us no wrong. Why should we be angry with him?" So they crowned Henry, and told Louis to return to his own country. But Louis was angry that, having been brought from France and promised the crown of England, he should be told to go away again. He would not go. So there was fighting once more. Louis sent to France for men, and a great fleet of ships filled with soldiers came sailing to England. Long ago, you remember, Alfred the Great had seen how much better it would be to stop the Danes from landing at all, and he built ships and fought them at sea. Now a brave man called Hubert de Burgh saw the same thing. When he heard that more Frenchmen were coming, he said, "We will never let them land. We will fight and conquer them at sea." So under his command a brave little English fleet sailed out from Dover to meet the great French fleet. And the English conquered the French, as Hubert had said they would. The wind was blowing from the English to the French, and the English threw quicklime in the air, which was blown into the eyes of the French, and blinded them. The English archers then poured arrows among them, while their quick little ships crashed with their pointed prows against the great French vessels, piercing holes in their sides, until the water rushed in and they sank. The English were altogether so quick and fearless that the French were no match for them, and their fleet was utterly destroyed. On land, too, the English beat the French, and Louis, seeing that his cause was lost, went back to France. Henry III was too young to rule, so Hubert de Burgh was made regent. He was a good regent, but his work was hard, for, after the wickedness and misrule of John, the kingdom was in a bad state. But in spite of his good and wise teacher, Henry grew up to be neither good nor wise. Listening to the advice of evil friends, he treated Hubert very badly, and at last obliged him to fly for his life. One night, while Hubert was sleeping quietly, he was suddenly awakened by a friend. "Fly, my lord Hubert," he cried. "Stay not a moment. The king has sent his soldiers to take you. I have ridden hard, but they are close behind me. You have not a moment to lose." Hubert got out of bed, and, not even waiting to dress, fled with bare feet and only a cloak round him to the nearest church. There, with his hand upon the cross, he waited in the dark and cold. Hubert fled to a church for sanctuary, or safety. When anyone was hunted by his enemies, if he ran into a church, reached the altar steps, and laid hold upon the cross, no one dared to hurt him. This was called taking sanctuary. It was considered a dreadful and wicked thing to kill anyone in sanctuary. Yet, you remember, the knights killed Thomas à Becket on the steps of the altar in Canterbury Cathedral. Hubert waited in the cold and silent church until, with the first grey streaks of dawn and the first early twitter of the birds, he heard the distant tramp of feet and the clatter of swords and armor. Nearer and nearer came the sounds, till at last a knight, followed by 300 armed men, dashed into the church. "Hubert de Burgh," said the knight, "in the king's name I command you to leave this holy place. Give yourself into my hands, that I may take you before the king to answer for your misdeeds as a rebel and traitor." "Nay," replied Hubert, "to my king have I ever been true, but he has listened to false friends who would take my life. Here have I sought God's safety. Here will I remain." "That shalt thou not do," cried the knight fiercely. "On, men, and seize him." Then the armed men rushed forward, forced Hubert from the altar, and carried him out of the church. "He is indeed a mighty man and strong," said the knight, when he saw how Hubert struggled. "He must be fettered, or we shall never carry our prize to London." Near the church stood a smith's forge, and the smith, who had already been aroused by the noise, was ordered to light his fire and make fetters for the prisoner. Soon the red fire glowed in the grey morning light, and the ring of hammer and anvil was heard. "For whom do I make these fetters?" asked the smith, as he paused in his work. "For the traitor and rebel, Hubert de Burgh," replied the knight. "What?" cried the smith, throwing down his hammer. "For Hubert de Burgh? That will I never do. Hubert de Burgh is no rebel. He saved us from the French. He gave us safety and peace. Some one else may do your evil deeds. No iron of mine shall ever fetter such noble hands." "Fool," cried the knight, drawing his sword, "do as I command you, or die." "I can die," replied the smith calmly. "Yes, kill me, do with me what you like. I will never make fetters for Hubert de Burgh." When the smith spoke like this, the knight began to feel rather ashamed, but he would not let Hubert go, both because he hated Hubert and because he feared the king. So he and his followers bound Hubert with a rope, set him upon a horse, and took him to the Tower of London. When the Bishop of London heard what had happened, he was very angry. Being a brave man, he went straight to the king. "My liege," he said to him, "have you heard how your soldiers have broken the peace of Holy Church, and have dragged Hubert de Burgh from sanctuary, casting him into prison?" "I know that the rebel and traitor Hubert de Burgh is now in prison," replied Henry. "Hubert de Burgh is no rebel," said the bishop, "and if he were, the soldiers have still no right to drag him from the safety of the church. Let him go back, or I shall excommunicate every man who has had to do with it." Very unwillingly the king allowed Hubert to go back to his place of safety, but he sent soldiers to dig a trench round the church, and round the bishop's house, which was close to it. There the soldiers watched day and night, so that Hubert might not escape, and so that no food might be taken into him. But in spite of the strict watch kept by the soldiers, Hubert's friends found means to send him food, and for many days he lived in the church. Then still closer watch was kept, and at last, thinking it a disgrace to die of hunger, Hubert left the church of his own accord, and gave himself up to the king's soldiers, who at once carried him off to the Tower of London. There he was kept for some time, but at last Henry, who was not really cruel, although he was weak and foolish, set him free. After that Hubert lived quietly in his own home, and took no more part in the ruling of the kingdom. End of chapter 37. Read by Kara Schallenberg. www.kray.org. On June 25th, 2006, in Oceanside, California. Chapter 38. Henry III of Winchester. The story of Simon de Montfort. King Henry III married a French lady called Eleanor. She brought a great many friends and relatives from France with her. Soon all the best places at court were given to these French people, just as they had been in the time of Edward the Confessor and of William the Conqueror. These strangers did very much as they liked. They set aside the Great Charter, and, when the English barons complained, the French nobles sneered at them. "What are your English laws to us?" they said. "We are far greater and more important than you. Such laws are made for English boors. We will not keep them unless we choose." This treatment was not to be borne, and at last the English rose in rebellion, and forced the king to send away his French favorites. It would take too long to tell of all the quarreling and fighting there was in this reign. Henry broke the Great Charter over and over again. No fewer than 10 times did he sign it, and each time, as soon as he had got what he wanted, he broke the promises he had made. But in spite of this, the power of the people was growing stronger. Henry spent a great deal of money, far more, indeed, than he ought to have done, but he could not wring gold from the people as William the Conqueror had been able to do. He had to ask the barons to give it to him, and they would not grant it until he promised something in return. Henry did indeed wring money from the Jews. They were the richest and most despised people in the country, and Henry, although he was not usually cruel, was very cruel to them. One Jew who refused to give Henry money was put into prison. Every morning his jailer came and pulled out one of his teeth, till at last the poor man could bear the pain no longer, and he gave the king what money he wanted. The bishops and barons grew tired of broken promises and such unkingly acts, so, when next Henry asked for money, a great council was called, to which all the barons and bishops in England came. There was a great deal of talking, and it seemed as if nothing would come of it, but the barons told Henry very sternly that he had not acted as a king ought. He had constantly broken his promises, and only if he now solemnly swore to the Charter would they give him money. Then Henry answered, "It is true. I am sadly grieved that I have acted as I have done. I will try to do better." But when he tried to blame some of the bishops and barons, they sternly said, "Our Lord King, we will not talk of what is now past, but of what is to come." Then all the bishops and archbishops dressed in their splendid robes and carrying lighted candles in their hands, walked in solemn procession to the great royal hall at Westminster. There, in presence of the king and all the barons, they solemnly excommunicated every one who should in the future take away in any degree the freedom of England. The words they used were very grand and terrible. The king, as he listened, held his hand over his heart. His face was calm and cheerful, and he looked as if he never had tried, and never would try, to take away his people's liberty. When the solemn sentence was finished, and the deep voice of the archbishop died away in silence, all the bishops and the archbishops threw down their lighted candles, crying, "May all those who take away our liberties perish, even as these lights perish." The bells were then rung joyfully, the candles were again lighted, and King Henry, standing among his people, spoke. "So help me God, all these promises will I faithfully keep, as I am a man, a Christian, a knight, and a crowned and anointed king." Thus once more the Great Charter was solemnly signed and sealed. But in spite of this ceremony Henry did not keep his promises. He listened to evil friends, who told him that if he did, he would not be king, nor even lord in England, but the subject of his people. Now there arose a great man called Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester. For many years he had been the faithful friend of King Henry, whose sister he had married. Henry sometimes heaped favors upon him, sometimes quarreled with him, just as he was pulled this way or that by his friends. When Simon de Montfort first came to England, the barons did not like him. "Here is another Frenchman," they said, "who comes to eat our bread and take away what belongs to us." But Simon soon showed that, if he was French in name, he was English at heart. As Henry continually broke his promises, Simon took the side of the barons and the people, and Henry feared him as he feared no other man. One day Henry went for a picnic on the Thames. He had rowed from his palace at Westminster some way down the river, when a thunderstorm came on, and he was obliged to take refuge in Simon's house, near which he was passing. As he arrived there, the thunderstorm began to clear. "There is nothing to fear now, my lord," said Simon, as he ran to meet the king. "I fear the thunder and lightning," replied the king, "but I fear thee more than all the thunder and lightning in the world." "My lord king," replied the earl sadly, "it is unjust that you should fear me who am your faithful friend. I have ever been true to you, and yours, and to the kingdom of England. Your flatterers are your enemies. Them you ought to fear." Led by Simon, the barons forced Henry to hold a council at Oxford, to draw up new laws for the better ruling of the kingdom. The wonderful thing about these laws was that they were written in English. Ever since the Conquest, the laws had been written in French or Latin, but at last English laws, for English people, were again written in their own language. But Henry did not keep these new laws any better than he had kept the old ones. The patience of the people came to an end, and there was war, the king's army fighting against Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, and his followers. This was called the Barons' War, and it ended in a great battle at Lewes, in which the king was defeated. After this battle it was really Simon de Montfort who ruled the country. Henry was indeed still king in name, but both he and his son, Prince Edward, were Simon de Montfort's prisoners. It was Simon de Montfort who laid the foundation of what is now our Parliament. Up to this time only bishops and barons had been allowed to come to the meetings of the council. Simon, however, now chose 2 knights from every shire or county, and 2 citizens from every city, and sent them also to the council to speak for the people and to tell of their wants. Now, too, the great council began to be called Parliament, which means talking place, for it is there that the people come to talk of all the affairs of the kingdom. Unfortunately, the barons could not long agree among themselves. Prince Edward escaped from Simon, and joined the discontented barons, and there was another battle between the prince's men and Simon's men, in which Simon was killed. The people had loved Simon, and now they sorrowed for his death, and called him a saint, and Sir Simon the Righteous. He is also called the father of the English Parliament. Although Prince Edward fought against Simon de Montfort, he had been his pupil, and had learned much from him, and he was growing into a wise prince. He now helped to make peace, and when peace again came to the land, Prince Edward, like so many other princes and kings, joined a crusade, and went to fight in the Holy Land. In 1272 A.D., while his son was still in that far-off country, King Henry died, having reigned 56 years. His reign had not been a happy one for England, yet good came of it, for his very weakness made the people strong, and out of the troubles of his reign grew our freedom of speech, and our power to make for ourselves the laws under which we have to live. End of chapter 38. Read by Kara Schallenberg, www.kray.org, on June 25, 2006, in Oceanside, California. Chapter 39. Henry III. The Story of the Poisoned Dagger. In far-off Palestine, the army of the Crusaders lay encamped before the town of Acre. The air was hot and stifling. The sun seemed a ball of fire hung in the still blue sky. Having put off his heavy armor for the sake of coolness, Prince Edward lay within his tent, wearing only a long loose robe of linen. He lay idle, thinking perhaps of the mighty deeds which his great-uncle, Richard Coeur de Lion, had done in this same place 80 years before, wondering too if he would be able to do as great things. Presently the curtains of the doorway parted. "My lord prince," said a soldier, bowing low, "the Emir of Jaffa hath sent his servant yet again. He craves to be admitted to your presence." "I will receive him," replied the prince, and the soldier once more left the tent. Edward had been fighting with the Emir of Jaffa, but now, pretending that he wished to become a Christian, this Emir sent daily messages and presents to the prince. And the prince, noble and honest himself, believed the Emir to be honest too. In a few minutes the curtains of the doorway parted once more, and the Emir's dark slave crept in. He bowed himself to the ground, then, kneeling humbly before the prince, drew out a letter. Edward took the letter, and, as the prince read, the slave crouched on the ground, watching him with his bright dark eyes. Then slowly, slowly his brown hand crept to the belt of his white dress. So slowly it crept that it seemed hardly to move. Suddenly, as quick as lightning, a keen bright blade flashed in the air and fell. But Edward too was quick and strong. He threw up his hand and caught upon it the blow which had been aimed at his heart. Then, springing from the couch, he overthrew the slave, and placing his foot upon the man's neck, wrenched the dagger from his grasp. In another moment the slave lay still and dead upon the sand. At the noise of the struggle, several frightened servants came running into the tent, and one of them, seeing the slave upon the sand, seized a stool and dashed his brains out. "Foolish man," said Prince Edward, "see you not that the slave is already dead? What you do is neither brave nor honorable, but the action of a coward." Prince Edward's wound was slight, but the dagger had been a poisoned one. When his wife, the beautiful Princess Eleanor, heard of it, she hurried to her husband's tent. Before those about her knew what she meant to do, she knelt down and, putting her lips to the wound, sucked it. It was said that if the blood from a poisoned wound was sucked at once after the wound was made, the wounded person would not die. It was a brave thing for Princess Eleanor to do, for she might herself have died. But she loved Edward so much that she was willing to risk her own life. Yet the wound grew worse, and it seemed likely that Edward would die. He was very calm and brave, and did not fear death, but tried to comfort his friends and servants, for they were all very sorrowful. But the princess sat beside him weeping, and would not be comforted. Then, calling for parchment and ink, Prince Edward wrote down all that he wished to be done with his money and lands after he was dead. This was called making his will. Now a clever doctor came to the prince and said, "I think I can cure you, only you will have to suffer a great deal of pain." "Do what you think best," said the prince, "and cure me if you can." Then the princess threw herself upon him, crying bitterly, and would not let anyone touch him. "I know you only want to hurt him more," she sobbed. "I cannot bear it." But Edward gently put her away. "Hush, hush," he said, and gave her into his brother Edmund's arms. "Do you love your lord and brother?" asked the doctor, turning to Edmund. "Aye, that I do," replied he. "Then take this lady away, and do not let her lord see her again until I tell you." So Princess Eleanor was led away weeping. "Ah, weep, lady," said Edmund gently. "It is better that you should weep than that all England should mourn." But England did not mourn, for the doctor was clever, and in less than a fortnight Prince Edward was again quite well. The false Emir sent messengers to Edward to say that he was sorry that the prince had been wounded, and was glad that he was better. But Edward no longer trusted the Emir. He looked gravely at the messengers. "You bow before me," he said, "but you do not love me, therefore go." And they were allowed to go in peace. Although Edward's soldiers longed to be revenged upon them and kill them, the prince would not allow it. After this, Edward did not stay long in Palestine. He heard that his father was ill, so he made a 10 years' peace with the Sultan, as the King of the Turks is called, and sailed back to England. On his way home he heard of his father's death. He knew that that meant he was now King of England, but he was very sad, for Edward had loved his father, although he could not help knowing that in many things he was foolish and untrustworthy. End of chapter 39. Read by Kara Schallenberg. www.kray.org. On June 25th, 2006, in Oceanside, California. Chapter 40. Edward I. The Little War of Chalons. In the days when knights wore armor and fought with sword and lance, they often used to play at war, as if they had not real fighting enough. These mock wars were called tournaments. They took place in a great open space or plain, which was called the lists. The knights, dressed in full armor, with painted shields and waving plumes, met each other and fought as they would in battle. Each wore the badge of his lady-love in his helmet. Generally the weapons which they used were blunted, so that they could not hurt each other much, but sometimes the weapons were sharp, and the mock fight ended in wounds and death. Round the lists were seats where fair ladies and great princes sat to watch the tournament. Each knight was eager to do great deeds, so that he might win the praise of the beautiful ladies who looked on. When the jousting, as it was called, was over, the fairest lady placed a crown of bay leaves on the head of the victor. This crown was prized more than if it had been of gold and gems, and each knight did his best to win it. It was thought that no knight could show his love and reverence for his lady better than by jousting and tilting in her name. As Edward travelled home to England, he passed through France, and near to a little town called Chalons. When the count of that place heard that the great English prince was passing through his land, he sent a message asking that they might meet in a tournament, with 1,000 knights on either side, lance for lance. Far and wide Edward was known as a brave and courteous warrior, and although his knights whispered that the Count of Chalons had no love for the prince, and meant to do him harm, Edward accepted the challenge, as such a message was called. Indeed, it seemed to him that he was in honour bound to do so, for it was counted unknightly to refuse a challenge. Great preparations were made, and on a fair day in May the plain of Chalons was gay with knights on horseback, and lovely ladies and people of all ranks in holiday dress, crowding to see the tournament. The earth seemed to shake as Edward and his 1,000 splendid and brave English knights thundered over it, but the Count of Chalons came to meet them, not with 1,000 men, as had been agreed, but with 2,000. Yet the English had no fear, and the tournament began. It was soon seen, however, that it was no friendly trial of strength, but a fight of bitter hate. The Count rode again and again at Edward, until his lance was splintered in his hand. Then throwing away the shaft, he seized the prince round the neck, and tried to drag him from his horse. This, according to the rules of the tournament, was a mean and unknightly thing to do. Edward sat his horse like a rock, and, great though the strength of the French count was, he could not move him. Then suddenly Edward spurred his horse. It sprang forward, and the count, who still clung tightly to Edward, was pulled from his saddle, and fell to the ground with a fearful crash. Enraged at such unknightly behaviour, Edward leaped down, and beat with the shaft of his lance upon the armour of the fallen count, heeding not his cries for mercy. As of a hammer upon an anvil, blow after blow fell, until at last the rage of the prince was spent, and he allowed the count to rise. The count then offered his sword to the prince in token of submission, but Edward turned from him in scorn. "Nay, Sir Knight," he said, "this day have you proved yourself no true knight. My servants may receive your tarnished sword, I shall not touch it." So the count was obliged to give up his sword to a common soldier, which, for a true knight, was the deepest disgrace. Meanwhile the English archers outside the lists, seeing that the French knights far outnumbered the English, and that there was no fair play, shot with their arrows at the horses of the French. Many of them fell dead, dragging their riders to the ground, where they lay helpless, trampled upon alike by friend and foe. Then the French foot soldiers joined in the fight, and the tournament became a battle. The English were far outnumbered, but even so they had the best of it. They took many of the French knights prisoners, making them pay large sums of money for their freedom. The common soldiers they slew, because, they said, they were but rascals, and of no great account. So fierce a tournament was this that, ever after, it was called the Little War of Chalons. End of chapter 40. Read by Kara Schallenberg. www.kray.org. On June 25, 2006, in Oceanside, California.